Story. Family laughs at poor dad, inheriting ruined mansion. Until the $200 million discovery shocked all. The air in Mr. Harrison's office was thick with the scent of old leather, lemon polish, and unspoken resentment. It was a sterile, mahogany-paneled room on the 34th floor of a glass tower that scraped the sky, and David Vance felt like an insect trapped in a jar. He sat rigidly on a plush leather chair that probably cost more than his truck, his gaze fixed on a point just past the lawyer's shoulder where the city sprawled out in a grid of concrete and ambition. His own hands, resting on his knees, were a map of his life calloused, scored with the fine white lines of 1,000 splinters, the nails short and clean, but permanently ingrained with the memory of wood dust and varnish. They were the hands of a carpenter, a man who built things to last. Right now, they felt clumsy and crude in this world of paper and abstract figures. Beside him, his 16-year-old daughter, Lily, was a miniature fortress of loyalty. Her back was straight, her chin was up, and though she tried to look impassive, David could feel the protective warmth of her arm pressed against his. Her sharp, intelligent eyes darted from face to face, taking in the scene with a silent judgment that made David feel a swell of pride. Across the vast, gleaming desk sat the reason for the room's suffocating atmosphere. His older brother, Richard, looked every bit the corporate titan he was. His suit was a symphony of tailored gray wool, his silver hair was perfectly coiffed, and he checked his Rolex with a sigh so theatrical it could have filled a concert hall. Beside Richard, his wife Clarice was examining her perfectly manicured blood-red nails as if they held the secrets to the universe, and this room held none. Her expression was one of profound, weary boredom, a look she had perfected over 20 years of looking down on David. At the head of the table, Mr. Harrison, a man who seemed to be made of the same starched linen and dry paper as the documents before him, cleared his throat. The sound was like a gavel, calling the tense silence to order. "We are gathered," he began, his voice a dry rustle, "to execute the last will and testament of Mr. Arthur Vance, who, as we know, passed peacefully 2 weeks ago." He adjusted his spectacles, his gaze lingering for a fraction of a second too long on David, a flicker of something that might have been pity. David's stomach tightened. His father, Arthur, a man who had been a giant in his childhood and a ghost in his adulthood, a brilliant draftsman who had slowly faded into a quiet, solitary life after David's mother had passed away, leaving his sons to navigate a world that valued them very differently. "I will be brief," Mr. Harrison continued, picking up the top sheet, "as per Arthur's explicit instructions." Richard shifted, leaning forward slightly. This was the main event. This was the confirmation of his status, his victory in the silent, lifelong competition he had been waging against a brother who hadn't even known he was playing. "To my eldest son, Richard Vance," Mr. Harrison read, his tone flat and procedural, "I leave my entire stock portfolio, including all shares in international equities and domestic bonds. Furthermore, I bequeath to him my controlling interest in Vance Enterprises." The lawyer paused, looking over his glasses. "Valued, at the close of market yesterday, at approximately $10,400,000. A quiet, satisfied smile touched Richard's lips. He leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. A king surveying his kingdom. Clarice allowed herself a small, triumphant smirk, finally looking up from her nails to cast a glance at David, her eyes glittering with condescending victory. $10 million. It was a number so large it felt like a foreign language to David. "Father was always a pragmatic man," Richard said, his voice smooth and deep. "He knew who could handle his legacy. He knew who had the vision to build upon it." The words hung in the air, each one a small, sharp stone aimed directly at David. The humble carpenter, the man who had stayed in their small hometown, who had married his high school sweetheart, who had raised a daughter on a modest income and the sweat of his brow. The failure, Mr. Harrison ignored him, his expression unchanging. He picked up the next sheet of paper. The final one. "And to my youngest son, David Vance." The room seemed to hold its breath. David felt Lily's hand find his. He braced himself. He expected a small trust, perhaps. A few $1,000s. A token. A final, paternal pat on the head. Mr. Harrison looked directly at him. "I leave the old family estate, Blackwood Manor, and all its contents." Silence. It was not a respectful silence. It was a hollow, ringing void, thick with confusion. David just stared. Blackwood Manor? The old stone house on the hill overlooking the town? The house they had all abandoned after his mother's death 30 years ago? It hadn't been lived in since. It was a local legend, a place kids dared each other to go near on Halloween. Then, the silence was shattered. It was Clarice. She let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh, like shattering glass. Blackwood Manor? She scoffed, her voice dripping with venomous amusement. You mean that pile of rotting timber and broken windows? Arthur, you old fox, she said to the air. You always did have a sense of humor. Richard joined in, a deep, rumbling chuckle that filled the space David's silence had left. He shook his head, looking at his younger brother with a mixture of pity and glee. Congratulations, little brother, he boomed, slapping his thigh. You've inherited a money pit, a landmark of decay. It'll cost you more to tear it down than the land is worth. What on earth will you do with it, David? Open a haunted house for tourists? The laughter washed over David, hot and humiliating. He felt his face flush, a tide of red creeping up his neck. He could feel Lily tense beside him, her small hand squeezing his with furious strength. He wanted to be invisible. He wanted to shrink into the expensive leather chair and disappear. But then, something else stirred within him. A flicker of defiance, a memory. He wasn't seeing the mahogany desk anymore. He was seeing a flash of sun on a dusty window pane in the manor's great library. He could almost smell the ghost of his mother's rose perfume and hear her laughter echoing down a long, unwalked hallway. He remembered his father, younger then, teaching him how to identify the constellations from the crooked balcony, his voice full of wonder. The laughter in the room faded into a dull buzz. It was Dad's home, David said, his voice quiet but clear. It came out hoarser than he expected. Our home. It means something to me. Clarice rolled her eyes with practiced ease. Oh, sentiment, how quaint. I'm sure your memories will keep you warm at night, because the roof certainly won't. She stood up, smoothing down her silk dress. Well, this has been illuminating. Richard, darling, we have a lunch reservation at the Cliveden. We can't be late. Richard pushed himself to his feet, still smiling. He clapped a hand on David's shoulder, a gesture that was meant to look fraternal, but felt like a nail being driven into a coffin. Enjoy your castle, David. Send me a postcard. And with that, they were gone, leaving a wake of expensive cologne and disdain. They swept out of the office, their laughter echoing faintly from the hallway, leaving David and Lily alone with the impassive Mr. Harrison. For a long moment, David couldn't move. He felt hollowed out, as if his brother had taken not just the money, but all the air from the room as well. He was the lesser son, and this was his inheritance, a ruin, a public testament to his father's final assessment of his worth. Mr. Harrison slid a large manila envelope across the polished desk. It landed with a soft thud. The deed is in here, David, the lawyer said, his voice a little softer now. Along with this. Oh. He opened a small drawer in his desk and placed an object on top of the envelope. It was a key. A single large ornate iron key, blackened with age and tinged with rust. It was heavy, ancient, and intricate. David remembered it from his childhood, the key to the great oak front door of Blackwood Manor. He reached out a trembling hand, and his calloused fingers closed around the cold metal. The key was heavy in his palm. It felt less like a gift and more like a burden. A final, cryptic message from a man he had loved but never truly understood. Lily finally spoke, her voice a fierce whisper. Don't listen to them, Dad. They're awful. David looked from his daughter's determined face to the iron key in his hand. He didn't have $10 million. He didn't have a portfolio or a controlling interest in anything. He had a deed to a ruin, a mocking laugh echoing in his ears, and this one, cold, heavy key. It wasn't just a key. It was a judgment, forged in iron. And as he stood up to leave the opulent office and return to his simple life, he had no idea that he was holding the key not to a forgotten house, but to a forgotten history, a secret so immense it would soon make his brother's fortune look like pocket change. The drive out of the city was a slow exhale. With every mile that put the gleaming skyscrapers behind them, David felt the suffocating weight of his brother's world lift, replaced by the familiar green of rolling hills and the wide open sky of his hometown. His old pickup truck rumbled along the winding country road, its engine a familiar, comforting growl. Lily sat silently in the passenger seat, the manila envelope with the deed resting on her lap like a sacred text. The iron key was in David's pocket, its cold, heavy presence, a constant reminder of the day's events. They turned onto Blackwood Lane, a road so seldom used that grass grew in a stubborn green stripe down its center. The trees on either side leaned in, their branches intertwining overhead to form a shady, dappled tunnel. It felt like crossing a threshold into another time. And then they saw it. Blackwood Manor didn't sit on its hill. It clawed at it. It was a sprawling beast of gray stone and dark timber, partially devoured by 3 decades of relentless nature. Ivy, thick as a man's arm, crept up the walls, its green fingers prying at the mortar and obscuring the elegant lines of the architecture. The roof, a complex landscape of gables and dormers, sagged in the middle like a tired old spine. Many of the windows were dark, vacant eyes, their glass long shattered, while others stared blankly, filmed over with years of grime. The grand front porch tilted at a drunken angle, its white paint peeled away to reveal the weathered, silvered wood beneath. It was exactly as Richard had described it. A ruin. A magnificent Gothic ruin. "Wow," Lily breathed, her voice a mixture of awe and dismay. "It's bigger than the pictures." David pulled the truck to a stop where the gravel driveway dissolved into weeds. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was filled with the rustle of wind through the overgrown trees and the distant, lonely caw of a crow. "And in worse shape," David said with a heavy sigh. He stared at the house, and for a moment, his brother's mocking laughter echoed in his mind. A money pit. Maybe he was right. What had their father been thinking? Was this a punishment? A cruel, final joke? He got out of the truck, the door groaning in protest. Lily joined him, her sneakers sinking slightly into the soft, untamed lawn. She looked from the derelict mansion to her father's face, her expression unreadable. David took a deep breath. The air here was different, cleaner, laced with the scent of damp earth, wild roses and pine. He started towards the house, his boots crunching on the gravel. As he stepped onto the porch, the old wood let out a long, protesting creak. But to David, it didn't sound like decay. It sounded like a welcome, a groan of recognition after a long, lonely wait. This was the place his father had loved, the place his mother had filled with light and music. Before the silence had descended, before the family had fractured, this house had been alive. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the iron key. It felt ancient in his hand. He approached the huge arched oak door, its wood warped and bleached by sun and rain. The keyhole was surrounded by intricate, rusted ironwork. With a deep breath, he slid the key into the lock. It resisted, gritty with rust and disuse, but with a firm twist. There was a loud, satisfying clunk as the 30-year-old tumblers finally gave way. He put his shoulder to the door and pushed. It scraped against the floor, opening just enough for them to slip inside. The moment they stepped over the threshold, they were plunged into a world of shadow and dust. The air was cool and still, thick with the smell of old books, decaying fabric, and rain that had found its way through the failing roof. Sunlight struggled through the grimy windows of the grand foyer, illuminating billions of dust motes dancing in lazy, golden shafts. Furniture, shrouded in white cloths, stood like a congregation of silent, lumpy ghosts. A grand staircase swept upwards into the gloom, its carved balustrade coated in a thick, velvety layer of dust. Lily coughed softly. "Smells like Grandpa's old workshop. Times 1,000. A small, sad smile touched David's lips. "That's the smell of my childhood." He took a tentative step forward, his boot falls echoing in the cavernous space. And as he did, the ghosts began to stir. He looked at the shrouded lump that was once the main hall table and saw, with perfect clarity, a vase of brilliant yellow daffodils his mother had just cut from the garden, their scent filling the house with the promise of spring. He glanced toward the archway leading to the living room and could almost hear the crackle of a fire in the great stone hearth, where he and Richard, as small boys, would lie on their stomachs reading adventure stories. "Dad?" Lily's voice was soft, pulling him from his reverie. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, honey. Just remembering." He began to walk, Lily following a few steps behind. They moved through the house like archaeologists of their own past. In the formal dining room, David ran a hand over a sheet-covered chair at the head of the long table. "Arthur, you can't have your nose in a book at the dinner table. His mother's voice, warm and teasing, echoed in his memory. His father had looked up from a thick tome on Roman aqueducts, a sheepish grin on his face. They moved into the library, a room that had been the house's true heart. Bookshelves soared from floor to ceiling on 3 walls, their contents a chaotic jumble of fallen volumes and thick dust. A ladder on a rail still stood against one shelf, a silent invitation. "The world is in here, David," his father had told him once, his hand sweeping across the room. "History, art, science. If you can read, you can go anywhere. You can build anything." David reached out and touched the spine of a leather-bound book. The leather was cracked and dry, but for a second, he could feel the ghost of his father's hand beside his. He'd spent so many years seeing his father as a quiet, withdrawn man, a simple draftsman who had retreated from the world. But in this room, surrounded by thousands of books on engineering, philosophy, and art, he felt the presence of someone far more complex. He saw Lily over by the great bay window, tracing a pattern in the grime on the glass. "You could see the whole town from here," she said quietly. "Your grandfather used to sit right there for hours," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just looking, thinking. I never knew what about." They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring. They discovered a music room, a beautiful Steinway piano draped in a sheet, its ivory keys yellowed with age. David lifted the cover, and Lily tentatively pressed a key. A single, discordant, mournful note hung in the dusty air before fading. Upstairs, they found his parents' old bedroom. The heavy curtains had been drawn, and the room was a cave of darkness. David pulled one open, and the sudden influx of light revealed a 4-poster bed, stripped bare, and an empty vanity table, a faint ring of spilled powder still visible on its surface. It felt too personal, too raw, and they quickly retreated. His own childhood bedroom was a time capsule. A faded poster of a spaceship was still tacked to the wall, and a few model airplanes he'd painstakingly built dangled from the ceiling, coated in cobwebs. It was the room of a boy who dreamed of building things that could fly. A boy who, in a way, had ceased to exist the day his mother died and the light went out of this house. Their last stop was the basement. Unlike the rest of the house, which felt like a place of faded elegance, the basement was purely functional. A sprawling stone-walled space, it housed the old furnace, storage shelves, and in the far corner, his father's workshop. This was a space David knew well. As a boy, he'd spent countless hours here, watching his father work. But seeing it now, it struck him differently. It was dusty, of course, but beneath the grime, it was obsessively organized. Hand tools, chisels, planes, saws hung in precise silhouettes on a pegboard. Blueprints for small projects, like a bookshelf or a garden bench, were neatly rolled and labeled. And on the workbench, under a canvas cloth, was something else. David lifted it, a cloud of dust billowing up. It was a half-finished project. An intricate architectural model of a bridge, carved entirely from basswood. The detail was astounding: tiny trusses, delicate suspension cables, a perfectly arched span. It was a work of art, a piece of miniature engineering that would have required incredible skill and patience. I don't remember him working on this," David whispered. This was far beyond the simple cabinetry and furniture he'd seen his father build. Lily ran a finger gently over a tiny, carved lamppost. "Grandpa was really good at this stuff, wasn't he?" David nodded, a lump forming in his throat. His father had been more than good. He had been brilliant, a quiet, hidden brilliance that the world and even his own son had never fully appreciated. As the sun began to set, casting long orange shadows through the broken windows, they returned to the foyer. The house was no longer just a ruin to David. It was a mausoleum, yes, but not of death. It was a mausoleum of memories, of a life lived, of a family that had once been whole. Richard had seen a liability. Clarice, a joke. But David, standing in the dust-filled silence, was beginning to see something else. He was seeing a story. His story. His father's story. "So," Lily said, breaking the silence, "what are we going to do with it?" David looked around the grand, decaying hall. The task of making it livable was monumental, perhaps impossible. It would take a fortune he didn't have. But tearing it down? Erasing these ghosts? That felt like a betrayal. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but we can't just let it fall down." He looked at his daughter, whose face was streaked with dust but whose eyes were bright and alive. For now, let's just try and let it breathe again. Let's clean a window. He picked up a corner of the sheet covering the hall table and pulled. The cloth, heavy with 30 years of settled history, billowed to the floor, revealing a solid oak table, its surface miraculously preserved. It was a small act, but it felt significant. It was a beginning. In the silent, forgotten house on the hill, David Vance and his daughter had decided not to run from the ghosts, but to get to know them. The decision to clean a window evolved over the following weekend into a full-scale assault on the dust of decades. David and Lily arrived early Saturday morning in his pickup truck, armed not with sentiment, but with bucket loads of practicality: brooms, mops, dust masks, work gloves, and a cooler packed with sandwiches and water. The initial, overwhelming sense of decay had been replaced by a carpenter's pragmatism. Every large project, David knew, was just a collection of small, manageable tasks. Their first target was the library. It had been the intellectual and emotional core of the house, and it felt like the right place to start reclaiming the space from time. They propped open the heavy front door and the creaking bay window, allowing a cross breeze to stir the stagnant air for the first time in a generation. The work was grueling. Dust, so fine and ancient it behaved like a liquid, coated every surface. Pulling the heavy, rotten curtains from the windows felt like wrestling with damp wool blankets, and they disintegrated in their hands. Cobwebs, thick and silken, hung from the ceiling like ghostly chandeliers. But as they worked, a quiet rhythm developed between them. David, on a stepladder, tackled the high shelves, handing down stacks of books to Lily, who sorted them into piles on the floor, some for keeping, some too water-damaged or mildewed to be saved. "Look at this one," Lily called out, holding up a heavy, leather-bound volume. "The Principles of Geometric Design." "Did Grandpa read all of these?" "Every single one," David said, his voice slightly muffled by his mask. "Twice, probably. Your grandmother used to say he didn't read books." He inhaled them. For hours, they worked in a companionable silence, punctuated by the scrape of the broom, the slap of books being stacked, and Lily's occasional comments on the titles she found. A treatise on structural integrity, the golden ratio in art and architecture, the biography of Isambard Kingdom Brunel. It was a collection that spoke of a deep, scholarly obsession with how things were built, how they stood, and why they were beautiful. By mid-afternoon, they had made tangible progress. Sunlight, no longer filtered through a thick film of grime, streamed into the room, illuminating the rich wood of the now visible floorboards. The air smelled less of decay and more of old paper and lemon-scented cleaner. Worn out and covered in grime, they sat on a dust sheet in the middle of the floor, eating their sandwiches. "It actually looks like a room now," Lily said, gazing around with a sense of accomplishment. "It's a start," David agreed, though his back ached and his mind was reeling with the sheer scale of the work still ahead. Was this all for nothing? Was he just polishing the brass on a sinking ship, driven by a stubborn sentimentality his brother would mock? It was as that doubt began to creep in that he saw it. On the highest shelf, tucked away in a corner, almost hidden by a ceiling beam, was a row of identical, plain-bound ledgers. But next to them was something different. A single book, bound not in canvas or cardboard, but in dark, supple leather. It was smaller than the others, and it had no title on its spine. It looked more personal. "I'll be right back," he said, getting to his feet. He repositioned the ladder and climbed up, his muscles protesting. Reaching the top shelf, he carefully pulled the leather book free. It was surprisingly heavy, its cover worn smooth at the edges from years of handling. He brought it down and sat back on the floor next to Lily. He ran his hand over the cover. It felt familiar, like a half-forgotten dream. "What is it?" Lily asked, leaning closer. I think this was his journal," David said, his voice hushed. He opened it carefully. The pages were thick, high-quality cream paper, filled with his father's distinctive handwriting, a precise, elegant script that was half architectural lettering, half calligraphy. But it wasn't a diary of daily events. It was a book of thoughts. The first page read, "A structure is not merely a collection of materials. It is an argument. It argues for a way of living." David and Lily began to read through it, their cleaning forgotten. The journal was a window into the mind of Arthur Vance. There were no entries about his feelings or his family, but there were pages filled with musings on the load-bearing capacity of a perfect arch, philosophical notes on the use of light and shadow in public spaces, and intricate, beautiful sketches of buildings that seemed to spring from a dream. There were designs for fantastical clock towers, sprawling garden mazes, and houses built into the sides of cliffs. They saw sketches of the very manor they were sitting in, with notes in the margins suggesting improvements and alterations his father had dreamed of but never made. It was the work of a restless, brilliant mind. He was an artist, Lily whispered, tracing a finger over a detailed drawing of a spiraling staircase. Why didn't he ever, become a famous architect? I don't know, David confessed, feeling a pang of guilt. After Mom died, he just closed up shop. He took small drafting jobs from big firms, working from home. He always said it was steadier, less pressure. I guess I just accepted that. But looking at the genius captured in these pages, that explanation now felt thin and incomplete. He continued to turn the pages, each one revealing another facet of the man he was realizing he'd never truly known. He was about 2/3 of the way through the journal when he felt it. A slight thickness between two pages. Carefully, he prized them apart. A single, folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, was tucked inside. It wasn't bound into the book. It had been placed there. David unfolded it. On it, written in the same elegant script but with a slightly bolder stroke, was a short, cryptic message. It was addressed to him. My dearest David, they will tell you that value is what a thing can be sold for. Do not listen. True value is never on the surface. It is hidden in the foundation, in the core of a thing. Remember this. Where the first light touches, my greatest work rests. Your loving father, Arthur. David read the note once, then twice. His heart began to beat a little faster. This wasn't just amusing. This was a message, a direct communication from beyond the grave. Lily, look at this. He handed her the note. She read it, her brow furrowing in concentration. Where the first light touches, she repeated, looking up at him. What does that mean? A jolt went through David, a sudden, powerful memory. He was a little boy again, 5 or 6 years old, woken up before dawn by his father. His father had carried him into the library, still dark and cold, and sat him on his lap in the big armchair by the bay window. Watch, Davy, his father had whispered. Watch the day begin. And he had watched, mesmerized as the first pure ray of sunlight had speared through that very window, cutting a clean, golden line across the dusty floor. The sunrise, David said, his voice filled with a new energy. It always came through the library window first. He used to sit here for hours right in that spot. Suddenly, the dusty, dilapidated room felt entirely different. It was no longer just a space to be cleaned. It was a puzzle box. The monumental task of restoration, the back-breaking labor, the scorn of his brother, it all faded into the background. His father hadn't left him a burden. He had left him a map. His greatest work, Lily said, her eyes wide with excitement. What do you think it is? Gold? Old family jewels? I have no idea, David admitted. But it's not just about money. He said it himself. True value is never on the surface. He looked around the library, his gaze sharp and analytical for the first time. He wasn't just seeing old wood and decaying books anymore. He was seeing a design, a secret hidden in plain sight. Hidden in the foundation, he murmured, reading the note again. Did he mean the literal foundation of the house? A loose stone in the cellar? Or was it a metaphor? The foundation of his collection of books, perhaps? The energy in the room had shifted. The exhaustion they'd felt moments before had been replaced by a thrumming, electric excitement. The ghosts of the past were no longer just sad specters. They were guides, whispering clues. Okay, Lily said, jumping to her feet and dusting off her jeans. So, we're looking for something on the east wall. Something the sun would hit first thing in the morning. David stood up, the journal still clutched in his hand. He looked at the vast wall of built-in bookshelves that flanked the bay window. It was 20 feet long and reached all the way to the 12-foot ceiling. It was a solid, imposing structure of dark oak filled with hundreds of books. Somewhere in that wall, somewhere in that vast sea of paper and wood, his father had hidden his greatest work. The cleanup was over. The treasure hunt had begun. The discovery of the note changed everything. The rest of the weekend was no longer about cleaning. It was about searching. Fueled by a potent cocktail of adrenaline and curiosity, David and Lily began their investigation of the library's east wall with feverish intensity. They abandoned their brooms and mops for the more delicate work of examination. They started with the idea of foundation. Could it be literal? They tapped along the baseboards, listening for a hollow sound. They ran their fingers over the seams where the bookshelves met the floor, searching for a loose plank or a hidden latch. Nothing. The structure was as solid as the day it was built, a testament to the skill of the craftsmen who had assembled it. Next, they turned their attention to the books themselves. Perhaps foundation referred to the foundational texts of architecture, the oldest or most important books in his collection. They pulled down heavy volumes by Vitruvius and Palladio, shaking them gently, ruffling their pages in search of a hidden key or another note. They found only the faint, dry scent of aging paper, and in one book, a pressed, long-dead flower, a fragile brown ghost of a memory that made David's throat tighten. By Sunday evening, as the light began to fail, they had examined every shelf within reach and found nothing. Frustration began to set in, dulling the sharp edge of their earlier excitement. "Maybe we're overthinking this," Lily said, sinking onto a dusty armchair. She was covered in a fine film of grime, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. Maybe he just meant that the view of the sunrise was his greatest work. David stood back, his hands on his hips, and surveyed the imposing wall of books. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Your grandfather didn't deal in vague sentimentality. He was a man of precision. Every word in that note was chosen for a reason. Where the first light touches, it's not about the light itself. It's about what it touches." He knew, with a certainty that resonated deep in his bones, that they were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle. The answer wasn't going to be found with a cursory search in the fading afternoon light. They needed to see it as his father had intended, at the exact moment of sunrise. "We need to be here at dawn," David declared. Lily's eyes widened. "You mean, stay here? Overnight?" The thought was both thrilling and unnerving. The house, which had felt like a place of nostalgic discovery during the day, took on a different character as darkness pooled in its corners. The familiar groans and creaks of the old structure sounded more pronounced, like the sighs of a sleeping giant. "We can't risk missing it," David insisted. "The angle of the light will be precise. It might only last for a minute. We need to be here watching." So, they made a plan. They drove back into town not for the night, but for supplies. They returned to Blackwood Manor an hour later with sleeping bags, powerful flashlights, a thermos of hot coffee for David and hot chocolate for Lily, and a bag of sandwiches. It felt like a clandestine camping trip, an adventure. They set up their small camp in the center of the now-cleared library floor. With their sleeping bags laid out and their flashlights casting dancing circles on the high, dark ceiling, the vast, empty house felt a little less intimidating. It felt like their territory now. As the night deepened, a comfortable quiet settled between them. The external world fell away, leaving only the two of them in the heart of the old house, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the promise of a secret. "Dad," Lily began, her voice soft in the stillness. "Can I ask you something?" "Anything. Why didn't you become an architect? Grandpa's journal? He was amazing. You've always been so good at building things. Didn't you ever want to design them too?" David sighed, taking a long sip of his coffee. He stared into the darkness beyond their small circle of light, at the towering silhouettes of the bookshelves. He hadn't spoken about this with anyone, not even his late wife. "I did," he admitted, his voice low. "When I was a kid, it was all I wanted. I spent all my time in his workshop. He taught me how to read blueprints before I could read a chapter book. He taught me about stress loads and tensile strength, about the beauty of a perfectly executed joint." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But my father, he was a genius. It was effortless for him. The ideas just poured out. When I tried, my designs felt clumsy, derivative. I could copy his work perfectly, but I couldn't create that spark, that magic." He looked at his own calloused hands in the dim light. "I remember showing him a design I'd worked on for weeks for a new community library. I was 17, so proud of it." He looked at it, nodded, and said, "The load distribution on the cantilevered entrance is flawed. It would collapse under heavy snow." He wasn't being cruel, he was just being an engineer. But it broke something in me. I realized I could never be him. I would always be in his shadow. Um, so, you chose carpentry. Lily finished for him, her voice full of understanding. I chose wood, David corrected gently. I chose something I could hold, something I could shape and perfect with my own hands. There's an honesty to it. A piece of wood is either straight or it isn't. A joint is either tight or it's loose. It wasn't a world of abstract genius. It was a world of tangible skill. I could be good at that. I could be my own man, not just a lesser version of him. Talking about it, saying the words aloud for the first time, felt like lancing a wound he hadn't known was still festering. They talked for hours, their voices low and intimate in the vast dark room. David told her stories about her grandmother, about the parties they used to have in this very house. Lily told him about her friends, her classes, her own quiet dreams. In the heart of the decaying manor, surrounded by the past, they were connecting in a way they hadn't in years. The house was giving him back more than just memories. It was giving him back a piece of his daughter. Eventually, they zipped themselves into their sleeping bags. David lay awake for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the house. The wind whistling through a cracked window pane, the skittering of a mouse in the walls, the deep groan of old timber settling. He felt strangely at peace. For the first time since the reading of the will, he didn't feel like a failure who had inherited a ruin. He felt like a son on the verge of understanding his father's final lesson. He must have drifted off, because the next thing he knew, Lily was gently shaking his shoulder. Dad, wake up. It's happening. He sat up, instantly awake. The room was no longer pitch black. A pale, ethereal gray light was filtering through the bay window, pushing back the shadows. The eastern sky was a soft canvas of lavender and rose. They scrambled to their feet, their hearts pounding with anticipation. They positioned themselves on the west side of the room, facing the wall of books, their backs to the window. They didn't want to watch the sunrise. They wanted to watch what the sunrise revealed. Slowly, agonizingly, the light grew stronger. The gray turned to a luminous silver. And then, it happened. The first direct ray of sun crested the distant hill. It sliced through the bay window like a laser beam, a perfect, sharp-edged spear of brilliant gold. It cut across the dusty air and struck the bookshelf. It didn't illuminate a wide area. It was a precise, focused beam. It hit a section of the wall about 8 feet up and 3 feet to the left of the window. And in its brilliant, unforgiving light, they saw what they had missed in the shadows. Most of the books on the shelves were individual volumes. But in that specific spot, illuminated like a divine revelation, was a set of what looked like 12 identical, leather-bound encyclopedias. And the sunlight revealed a subtle difference. The dust on 11 of them was even, undisturbed. But on one, the third one from the left, the dust was thinner, and there was a faint, almost invisible scuff mark on the wood of the shelf directly beneath it. It was a sign of movement. But it was more than that. The light struck the gilded lettering on the spines, and David's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't a title. It was a complex series of numbers and symbols. In the direct, unfiltered light of dawn, he realized it wasn't a book at all. Lily, look, he whispered, his voice trembling. The spine. It's not a book. It's carved. He grabbed the ladder, his movements clumsy with excitement, and scrambled up. As he got closer, he could see it clearly. The book was a single, solid block of oak, masterfully carved and painted to look exactly like the other volumes in the set. It was a perfect piece of camouflage, a work of genius in its own right. It was a decoy. His heart hammering against his ribs, he reached out and wrapped his fingers around the false book. He took a deep breath, and he pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from deep within the wall, came a low grinding sound. It was the sound of a hidden mechanism, of gears and counterweights that hadn't moved in 30 years, reluctantly coming to life. A deep, resonant thunk echoed through the library. And then, with a groan of ancient wood and metal, the entire section of the bookshelf, a 10-foot-tall monolith of oak and leather-bound volumes, began to swing slowly, silently inward. It opened like the door to a pharaoh's tomb, revealing not a dusty wall behind it, but a rectangle of absolute, impenetrable darkness. Set into the stone of the house's true foundation was a heavy, circular, industrial-grade vault door, complete with a large, spoked wheel at its center. The sight of the vault door stole the air from their lungs. It was an object so profoundly out of place in the dusty, domestic setting of a library that it felt like a tear in the fabric of reality. It was not the door to a wine cellar or a pantry. It was the door to a fortress, thick, dark steel, studded with heavy rivets, with a central combination dial that looked like it belonged on a bank safe from a bygone era. For a full minute, David and Lily could only stare, their minds struggling to reconcile what they were seeing with what they knew of their quiet, unassuming father and grandfather. This was not the work of a humble draftsman. This was the work of a man with secrets. Deep, heavy secrets. "Is that real?" Lily finally whispered, her voice barely audible. David slowly descended the ladder, his eyes never leaving the monolithic door. He felt a tremor in his hands, a mixture of fear and an almost unbearable excitement. He stepped into the recess created by the swinging bookshelf, the air growing cooler, smelling of cold stone and metal. He ran his hand over the surface of the vault. It was cold, solid, and utterly uncompromising. "It's real," he breathed. The central dial was a complex brass mechanism etched with numbers and symbols. A combination lock. His first thought was one of despair. How could they possibly know the combination? It could be anything, a birthday, an anniversary, a random string of numbers lost to time. Then, he remembered. "The journal," he said, a jolt of realization running through him. He hurried back to their makeshift camp on the floor and grabbed the worn leather book. He didn't know what he was looking for, but his father's note had been the key so far. The answer had to be in here somewhere. He flipped it open, his fingers clumsy with haste. He scanned the pages of sketches and philosophical notes, his eyes searching for anything that looked like a code. Lily peered over his shoulder, her flashlight beam dancing across the elegant script. "Dad, wait, go back," she said suddenly, pointing. "The inside cover." David turned back to the very front of the journal. On the stiff, thick paper of the inside cover, a place he had overlooked in his initial scan, was a small, faint pencil drawing. It wasn't an architectural sketch. It was a simple diagram, a circle, with a series of numbers and arrows pointing to specific positions: 42 right, 18 left, 67 right. It was a sequence. "The combination," David said, his heart pounding. He approached the vault again, the open journal in his hand. He took a deep, steadying breath, the scent of dust and old paper filling his lungs. This was it, the culmination of his father's cryptic message. He placed his hand on the heavy, spoked wheel in the center of the door. It felt cool and solid beneath his palm. Following the diagram, he began to turn the dial. The mechanism moved with a series of satisfying, oily clicks, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. 42 to the right. Click, click, click. 18 to the left. Click, click. 67 to the right. Click. On the final number, there was a deep, resonant thunk from within the door's mechanism, a sound of release. David gripped the spokes of the large wheel with both hands and pulled. It resisted for a moment, then began to turn with a low, heavy groan. The vault door was perfectly balanced. It swung open smoothly, silently, revealing not a dark, dusty space, but a room filled with a soft, steady, low light. David and Lily stood on the precipice, peering inside. It was not a treasure room filled with gold bars or glittering jewels. It was a small, climate-controlled chamber, no larger than a walk-in closet. The air that wafted out was cool, dry, and sterile. Along one wall were metal shelves, and on those shelves, arranged with military precision, were dozens upon dozens of thick, rolled-up scrolls, each one tied with a simple black ribbon and labeled with a small hanging tag. In the center of the room stood a single, beautiful draftsman's table, its surface clear except for one large, unrolled scroll held down at the corners by polished stone weights. This was the heart of the secret. This was Arthur Vance's greatest work. They stepped inside, their footsteps silent on the sealed concrete floor. The light source was a series of low-wattage archival bulbs recessed in the ceiling, designed to illuminate without causing damage. David was drawn to the table. He leaned over the unrolled scroll. It was a sheet of high-quality vellum, and on it was a drawing of breathtaking complexity and beauty. It was a building, a skyscraper, so audacious and elegant it seemed to defy gravity. It was a symphony of glass and steel, twisting towards the sky in a way that was both organic and futuristic. Every line was drawn by hand with an artist's precision. In the bottom right-hand corner, in his father's unmistakable script, was the title, The Olympus Tower, Dubai, and beneath it, a single proud signature, Arthur Vance. David stared, his mind struggling to process the information. He'd seen this building before. On the news. In magazines. It was one of the most famous new structures in the world, a landmark of modern architecture. But the credit had always gone to a massive, faceless international firm. Dad. Lily's voice was a choked whisper. She was standing by the shelves, a scroll in her hands. She had untied the black ribbon, and the vellum had partially unrolled. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. He went to her side. The tag on the scroll she held read SBSYD. She held it out to him with a trembling hand. He took it and carefully unrolled it on the floor. It was a bridge, a magnificent, sweeping arch of steel and cable, instantly recognizable. The Starlight Bridge, Lily said, pulling out her phone. Her fingers flew across the screen. In Sydney. It opened 3 years ago. It says here it was designed by Omnicorp Architectural. David felt a wave of dizziness. He grabbed another scroll from the shelf. Tag. HMN Nike. He unrolled it. It was a museum, a beautiful, deconstructed cube of white marble and glass that he had seen on a postcard once. The Helios Museum of Modern Art, New York, he read aloud. One by one, they unrolled the scrolls, their initial awe giving way to a staggering, world-altering realization. The Serafina Concert Hall in Shanghai, the Centurion Financial Center in London, the Aquarius Oceanic Institute in Monaco, a portfolio of the last 20 years of landmark global architecture, all signed with the same quiet, confident hand, Arthur Vance. His father had not been a simple draftsman taking on small jobs. He had been the secret source, the ghost, the anonymous genius behind a generation of architectural marvels, selling his soul's work to massive corporations who then took the credit. He had chosen anonymity over fame, a quiet life in a small town over a penthouse in a city, a dusty old house over a global legacy. He never told us, David said, his voice cracking. He sank to his knees, surrounded by the proof of his father's secret life. The weight of it was immense. The years of quiet withdrawal, the retreat from the world, it hadn't been a sign of defeat. It had been a choice. A profound, unbelievable choice. Why? Lily asked, her voice filled with a million questions. Why would he do this? Why would he let other people take credit for all of this? David could only shake his head, his mind reeling. Amidst the shock, a practical thought surfaced in his mind. He pulled out his phone, his fingers feeling numb and clumsy. He didn't know who to call. A museum? An art gallery? He settled on the only professional he trusted, Mr. Harrison. He explained the situation in a halting, disbelieving voice. The vault, the scrolls, the famous buildings. Mr. Harrison, for the first time since David had known him, was silent for a long moment. David, the lawyer finally said, his voice strained, do not touch anything else. Do not let anyone into that house. This is beyond a simple inheritance issue. These aren't just blueprints. If they are the original, signed, hand-drawn concept masters, they are historical artifacts. They are works of art. Their value is incalculable. He gave David the number for a renowned appraiser in the city, a woman who specialized in architectural documents and fine art. Tell her I sent you. Tell her it's a matter of utmost urgency and discretion. Half an hour later, David was on the phone with a woman named Dr. Alistair Finch, whose crisp, professional voice was a stark contrast to the whirlwind in his head. He explained what he had found. He could hear her skepticism through the phone. Original hand-drafted vellums of the Olympus Tower, she said. Mr. Vance, those are believed to have been lost. The corporate firm claims they were destroyed in a digital conversion process years ago. Well, David said, looking at the magnificent drawing on the table, I'm looking at one right now. Huh. He agreed to send her high-resolution photos. He and Lily spent the next hour carefully photographing a few of the scrolls, their hands shaking so much the first few attempts were blurry. Finally, he emailed them, his finger hovering over the send button as if he were about to launch a missile. The reply came less than 5 minutes later. It was a phone call. Dr. Finch's voice was no longer skeptical. It was breathless. "Mr. Vance," she said, and he could hear the suppressed excitement in her tone. "I must see these in person. But based on these images, if the entire collection is of this quality and significance, a preliminary, and I must stress, highly conservative estimate." She paused. David held his breath. "You are not looking at a collection of blueprints, Mr. Vance. You are looking at a treasure, an artistic and historical treasure that could easily be valued in excess of $200 million. MCRT. The phone almost slipped from David's hand. He leaned against the cool steel of the vault door for support, his legs suddenly weak. $200 million. The number was absurd, comical. It was a number from his brother's world, not his. He looked around the small secret room, at the legacy of the quiet man who had hidden his genius from the world, and he finally understood the first line of his father's note. "They will tell you that value is what a thing can be sold for. Do not listen." The treasure wasn't the money. The treasure was the truth, hidden in the heart of the house, waiting for the son who had been willing to see a home instead of a ruin. The hours following Dr. Finch's phone call were a blur of surreal activity. David and Lily carefully rolled up the blueprints they had disturbed, retied them with their black ribbons, and placed them back on the shelves with the reverence of museum curators handling priceless artifacts. David then swung the heavy bookshelf back into place, the mechanism groaning softly before clicking shut, concealing the vault once more. The library once again looked like a dusty, forgotten room. But now they knew its secret. The very air felt different, charged with the weight of what lay behind the wall. Dr. Finch had been adamant about discretion, warning David that news of this magnitude could not be contained for long. "A find of this nature will have ripples, Mr. Vance," she had said. "Be prepared." David, however, was not prepared. He was a carpenter, a man whose life was governed by the simple physics of wood and nails. He was not equipped for the complex, treacherous world of nine-figure art discoveries. His first instinct was to protect the secret, to keep his father's hidden life just that hidden. But he also knew that a discovery this monumental could not simply be re-entombed. It belonged, in some way, to the world. He and Lily drove home in a state of shared shock, the $200 million figure hanging between them like a third passenger. They didn't speak much. There were no words for what they were feeling. It was too big, too transformative. David felt an immense, aching pride in his father, mingled with a profound sadness for the quiet genius who had hidden his light from the world. The illusion of privacy lasted less than 24 hours. The leak, when it came, was not a trickle but a flash flood. David never found out its source, whether it was an overexcited assistant at the appraiser's office, a boastful remark from Mr. Harrison's firm overheard by the wrong person, or simply the inevitable result of too many important people knowing an important secret. The first sign was a single, speculative article on a niche art and architecture blog. Rumors of a lost Vance collection surface. By noon, it had been picked up by a major news wire. By late afternoon, it was a headline. "The Ghost of Genius. Forgotten Son Inherits Secret $200-meter Blueprint Hoard from Anonymous Architect." The story was sensational, a perfect cocktail of family drama, lost treasure, and staggering wealth. It had everything, and it spread like wildfire. David's phone, a simple smartphone he mostly used for work calls and weather updates, began to ring. First, it was a local reporter, then a national one, then a dozen more. He didn't answer. He turned the ringer off and watched the screen light up with calls from numbers he didn't recognize, his stomach churning with a growing sense of dread. He felt exposed, like a hermit crab pulled from its shell. Then, a call came from a number he did recognize. Richard. His hand hovered over the screen. A part of him wanted to ignore it, to throw the phone against the wall. But another part, a weary, hopeful part, wondered if perhaps his brother would be proud. Maybe this revelation of their father's genius would somehow bridge the chasm between them. He was wrong. He answered the call. "David." Richard's voice was not warm. It was a low, dangerous growl, tight with controlled fury. There was no greeting, no preamble. "What is this I'm seeing on the news? Is this some kind of joke?" "It's not a joke, Richard," David said, his own voice quiet. It's true. There was a moment of charged silence on the other end of the line, as if Richard were absorbing the reality of it. When he spoke again, his voice had risen in pitch, losing its corporate smoothness and revealing the raw, ugly greed beneath. $200 million, blueprints? In that derelict pile of garbage he left you? How is that possible? He was a draftsman. He made furniture in the basement. He was more than that, Richard. He was... Don't you tell me what he was, Richard snarled. I'm his son, too. I ran his company. You think he'd hide an asset like that from me? The one who actually understands finance? This is a family asset, David. It doesn't belong to you. The injustice of the accusation stung David. He left the house and its contents to me, Richard. The will was very clear. The will is garbage, Richard shouted, his voice now cracking with rage. He was an old man. He was losing his mind. He had no idea of their value. This is a mistake, a clerical error, and I will not let you steal our family's legacy because of some sentimental whim of a senile old man. The accusation against their father's sanity was a physical blow. David felt his hand tighten on the phone, his knuckles turning white. Don't you dare talk about him that way. I'll talk about him however I want. You have no idea what you're doing, David. You're a carpenter. You'll be eaten alive. This belongs in the family trust. It needs to be managed properly. I'm coming over there. No, David said, his voice firm for the first time. You're not. You can't stop me. That is half my inheritance you're sitting on. No, Richard, David repeated, a cold resolve hardening within him. You got your inheritance. $10 million. You said it yourself. Father was a pragmatic man. He gave you exactly what he thought you deserved. He ended the call, his hand trembling with adrenaline. The hope for reconciliation had died, replaced by a grim certainty. This was not a family matter anymore. It was a war. The proof of that arrived the next day, not as a phone call, but as a sleek black car that pulled up outside David's modest home. A courier in a sharp suit emerged and hand-delivered a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was from the law firm of Thorne, Cromwell, and Finch Richards lawyers. He sat at his small kitchen table, Lily watching him with worried eyes, and opened it. The language was cold, formal, and brutal. It was a formal notice of their intent to contest the will of Arthur Vance. The grounds were clearly stated: diminished mental capacity and unsound mind at the time of signing. They were claiming their father was incompetent. They were prepared to drag his name, his memory, and his reputation through the mud to get their hands on the money. The letter went on to demand that David cease and desist from any attempts to sell, move, or appraise the contents of Blackwood Manor, referring to the blueprints as the disputed assets. It ended with a thinly veiled threat of protracted litigation that would drain him of any resources he had. David dropped the letter on the table as if it were on fire. He felt sick. Richard wasn't just trying to take the money. He was trying to invalidate his father's entire life, to paint him as a doddering old fool who didn't know his own mind. The man who had designed the Olympus Tower, the man who had filled a secret vault with proof of his quiet genius. He looked at Lily, whose face was a mask of anger and fear. He's going to say Grandpa was crazy, she said, her voice small. A fire ignited in David's chest, burning away the fear and shock. It was a protective, righteous anger. He had spent his whole life feeling inferior to his brother, accepting his role as the quiet, less successful son. He had allowed Richard's scorn to define him. But this was different. This was an attack on his father, the man who had secretly been a giant among men. This was an attack on the final, beautiful gift he had left him. David stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet suburban street, which now felt like the calm before a storm. The world saw a $200 million prize. Richard saw a stolen fortune. But David was beginning to see the truth. The blueprints were not the inheritance. The money was not the legacy. The real inheritance was the responsibility to protect his father's name. No, David said, turning back to Lily, his voice clear and hard as stone. He's not. This isn't about money anymore. It's about respect. He picked up the phone and dialed Mr. Harrison. When the lawyer answered, David's voice was steady. Mr. Harrison, he said, I've received a letter from my brother's attorneys. It seems we have a fight on our hands. The vultures were circling, their shadows falling over Blackwood Manor. But they would find that the humble carpenter they intended to prey upon was no longer a soft target. He was the guardian of a giant soul, and he would not back down. The days that followed the arrival of the legal notice were a siege. David's quiet life was shattered, replaced by the incessant hum of a battle he never wanted to fight. The world had descended upon him, and it was loud, greedy, and invasive. Paparazzi-style photographers lurked at the end of his street, hoping for a picture of the carpenter millionaire. His voicemail filled daily with messages from art dealers, investment bankers, and long-lost cousins, all offering their unsolicited advice and services. He felt adrift in a storm, buffeted by forces he didn't understand. The legal jargon in the letters from Richard's lawyers was a foreign language designed to intimidate and confuse. Mr. Harrison was a steady, reassuring voice on the phone, advising patience and caution, but the pressure was immense. Richard's legal team was filing motions, demanding access to the manor for their own appraisers, and building a case brick by brick to paint Arthur Vance as a man detached from reality. The core of their argument was cruel in its simplicity. What sane man, they argued, would sit on a $200 million asset and leave it, without any specific instructions, to a son who had no means to protect it, while leaving a comparatively small sum to his other, financially astute son? They painted it not as a choice, but as a catastrophic failure of a decaying mind. Besieged and overwhelmed, David found himself retreating, not in surrender, but in search of sanctuary. One evening, after another draining call with Mr. Harrison, he drove out to Blackwood Manor. It was the only place he felt he could think. The media hadn't discovered its location yet. It was his one refuge from the storm. He let himself in with the heavy iron key, the house greeting him with its familiar silence. He didn't turn on any lights. He walked through the moonlit rooms to the library, and without hesitation, opened the secret passage. He stepped into the cool, quiet vault, the soft archival light a balm to his frayed nerves. The bookshelf swung shut behind him, sealing him off from the world and its noise. He was here for a reason. Richard's attack was focused on their father's state of mind. David realized that the only true defense, the only real weapon he had, was to understand that mind himself. He needed more than just the cryptic note. He needed to understand the why. He went to the shelves, but this time he wasn't looking at the blueprints. Tucked away on a lower shelf, almost hidden behind a stack of rolled vellum, were several more leather-bound journals, identical to the first one he had found. They were a complete set, a lifetime of thoughts. He pulled out the earliest volume, dated nearly 40 years prior, and sat down at the draftsman's table. He opened the first page and began to read. Here, he found a different Arthur Vance. Not the quiet, withdrawn father he knew, but a young man electric with ambition. The pages were filled with a fiery passion, a belief in the power of architecture to shape society. He wrote of traveling through Europe, marveling at the cathedrals of France and the aqueducts of Rome. He was brilliant, idealistic, and hungry. Then, David found the entry that changed everything. It was dated a year later. The tone was no longer idealistic. It was scorched, bitter, and full of a white-hot rage. They stole it, the entry began, the script uncharacteristically jagged. The design for the Meridian Tower. My design. Every line, every curve, every calculation. I poured my soul into it. I presented it to them, to the board at Stirling Gable. They smiled, they shook my hand, they told me it was visionary but impractical. A week later, my contract was terminated. 6 months later, the press release. Stirling Gable announces their new flagship project, the Meridian Tower. Architect of record. Philip Sterling. My professor. My mentor. Mentor, Sidhu.Nain, David read on, his own heart aching with a second-hand sense of betrayal. The entry detailed how Arthur had tried to fight it. He had his early sketches, his notes, but the firm had a team of lawyers who drowned him in paperwork. They produced backdated documents and sworn affidavits from board members. Philip Sterling himself publicly dismissed Arthur as a talented but disgruntled junior draftsman who had contributed a few minor ideas. Arthur was crushed, not just financially, but spiritually. He had been betrayed by a man he trusted, his creation stolen, and his name erased. I have learned a bitter lesson, the entry concluded. The ink slightly blurred as if from a fallen tear. The world does not reward the creator. It rewards the man who puts his name on the final product. They do not care for the soul of a thing, only its ownership. I will never let them steal my soul again. I will create. I will build worlds on paper. But my name will belong only to me. My work will be my own, even if the world never knows it. David closed the journal, the weight of his father's 40-year-old pain settling upon him. This was the source. This was the wound that had festered, that had driven his father into a shell of anonymity. He hadn't retreated from the world out of failure or weakness. He had made a strategic withdrawal to protect the one thing he had left: the integrity of his own genius. He had continued to design, selling his work to the very same kind of corporate giants, but on his own terms, anonymously, for a flat fee, keeping the original, soulful vellums for himself. They could buy the building, but they could never again own the art. He picked up the final journal, the one from the last years of his father's life. The handwriting was a little shakier, but the mind was as sharp as ever. He flipped through the pages, filled with more peaceful musings on design and nature, until he found what he was looking for. An entry from around the time the will must have been written. It was a reflection on his sons. "Richard," he wrote, "is a force of nature. He sees the world as a series of transactions, of assets and liabilities. He has taken the small company I gave him and multiplied its value tenfold. He is a builder in his own way. He builds wealth. He wears his success like a fine suit of armor. I am proud of his drive, but I fear he cannot see the architecture for the scaffolding. He values the price of things, but not their worth." David's breath hitched. He turned the page. "And David, my quiet David, he did not follow in my footsteps. And for that, I am both saddened and relieved. He chose a simpler path. He chose the honesty of wood, the truth of a level line. He has calluses on his hands and little in his bank account, but he has built a life. He has built a family. He has a foundation of his own. He does not seek the spotlight. He seeks only to create a thing of quality and to provide for those he loves. He does not see the world in dollars and cents. He sees it in strength, in beauty, in purpose." Then came the passage that made David's vision blur. It was the key, the shield and the sword he had been searching for. "My final design is not a building, but this will. It is a test of values. I will leave Richard the thing he understands, the business, the money, the tangible symbols of success. And I will leave David the house, the heart of our family, the place of memories. He will see the ruin, but I pray he will also see the potential. He will see the decay, but I trust he will feel the history. Hidden within its foundation is my true legacy. It is a legacy Richard would monetize, liquidate, and add to a portfolio. David, I hope, will understand it. I have learned in my long life that some people are so poor, all they have is money. I will ensure my wealth, the real wealth, the wealth of the soul, goes to the son who understands this." David put the journal down on the draftsman's table. The silence of the vault was absolute. The cold, sterile air no longer felt oppressive. It felt sacred. He finally understood. The will wasn't an act of a senile mind. It was the most brilliant, calculated, and deeply personal design of his father's life. It was a perfectly engineered test, and every outcome had been accounted for. His father had known Richard would react with fury and greed. He had known he would see the inheritance in terms of monetary value alone. And he had trusted that David, his quiet son, would see something more. He was not just the inheritor of a fortune. He was the chosen custodian of a legacy. He was the executor of his father's final, profound statement about what it means to be truly wealthy. A deep, unshakable calm settled over him. The fear was gone, replaced by a clarity so pure, it was like the first light of dawn through the library window. He was no longer a carpenter caught in a legal storm. He was his father's son, armed with the truth. He stood up, his movements sure and steady. He left the journals on the table and stepped out of the vault, closing the hidden door behind him. He walked out of the library and stood on the sagging front porch of Blackwood Manor, looking out at the town glittering in the valley below. The house no longer seemed like a ruin. It seemed like a fortress. His fortress. Richard could come with his army of lawyers. The world could clamor at the gates with its greed and its headlines. It didn't matter. They were attacking a man on the basis of his sanity, but David held the proof of his genius. And more importantly, he held the proof of his love. The summons came not as a request, but as a demand. A formal letter from Richard's lawyers arrived, stating their intention to inspect the property with their own team of appraisers and a court-appointed psychologist to assess the environmental evidence of the late Mr. Vance's mental state. It was a thinly veiled invasion. David knew they weren't coming to appraise blueprints. They were coming to build their case that the house was the lair of a madman. Mr. Harrison advised him to refuse, to drag the process out in court. But David, armed with his newfound clarity, had a different idea. "No," he told his lawyer over the phone. "Let them come. David, that's unwise. They will twist everything they see." "I know," David replied, his voice calm and steady, "but I'm not going to hide anymore. I'll be there to meet them." And so, on a crisp, clear autumn afternoon, David waited. He didn't wait in his own small house or in a lawyer's office. He waited at Blackwood Manor. He had spent the morning there, not cleaning or repairing, but simply being. He'd opened a few more windows, letting the fresh air circulate, and wiped the thickest layer of dust from the grand oak table in the foyer. He wasn't staging the house, he was simply allowing it to breathe. He stood on the front porch, the same porch where he had felt so small and overwhelmed just weeks ago, and watched the lane. He wore his work clothes, sturdy jeans and a flannel shirt, comfortable in his own skin. He was not trying to be anyone but himself. He heard the car long before he saw it. The aggressive, high-pitched whine of a high-performance engine, utterly alien to the quiet country lane. A moment later, a gleaming black Mercedes sedan burst through the tunnel of trees and screeched to a halt in the overgrown driveway, its tires spitting gravel. The car looked absurdly out of place, a sleek urban predator trespassing in a forgotten kingdom. Richard emerged from the driver's side. He was dressed in a sharp, dark suit, but his face was tight with anger, his usual corporate polish replaced by a raw, naked avarice. Clarice slid out of the passenger seat, her expression a mask of disgust as she surveyed the crumbling manor. Behind them, two other men in suits got out of a second car, a humorless-looking lawyer and a man with a clinical detached air who David guessed was the psychologist. They marched towards the house like a small hostile army. "David," Richard barked, foregoing any greeting, "this is a farce. Let's get this over with. My legal counsel, Mr. Abernathy, and Dr. Mills are here to conduct their assessment." "They're not stepping foot inside this house, Richard," David said. His voice was quiet, without anger, but it held a firmness that made the approaching party halt a few feet from the porch steps. Richard's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "You can't stop us. We have a court order pending. This is a jointly held family asset until the will is settled." "This is my home," David stated simply, "and you are not welcome in it." Clarice let out an exasperated sigh. "Oh, for heaven's sake, David, stop this sentimental nonsense. We are talking about $200 million. Do you have any idea what that kind of money means? It's not for a small-town carpenter to manage. It belongs to the family. It belongs in capable hands." "Your hands, you mean?" Lily's voice cut through the air, sharp and clear. She had appeared in the doorway behind David, her arms crossed, her young face set with a fierce loyalty that mirrored her father's resolve. Clarice shot her a venomous look but was interrupted by Richard, who took a step forward, jabbing a finger in David's direction. "Father was not well, David. Can't you see that? Look at this place. He let it rot. He lived in squalor in his final years. He hid a fortune in the walls and didn't tell a soul. These are not the actions of a sane man. He owed it to his family, to me, the one who carried his name in the business world, to disclose that asset. He owed me that money." The words, "owed me that money," hung in the air, stripped of all pretense. It was the heart of the matter, the raw, ugly truth of Richard's position. David looked at his brother, at the rage twisting his handsome features, and he felt not anger, but a profound, aching pity. He stepped forward to the edge of the porch, so he was looking down at them. The slight elevation gave him an unforeseen authority. "You're wrong, Richard," he said, his voice resonating with the quiet power of the truth he now held. "You've been wrong about everything, about this house, about Dad, and about me." He let the words settle. "You see a ruin," David said, gesturing to the house behind him. "I see a place full of memories, a place Dad loved. He knew you would see a liability. That's why he didn't leave it to you. Ember one." He then looked his brother directly in the eye. "And the blueprints. He knew what they were worth. He knew down to the last dollar. His mind was clearer than yours or mine. He didn't make a mistake. His will was the most carefully planned design of his life. The lawyer Abernathy cleared his throat. Mr. Vance, your sentimental interpretations are irrelevant. The facts suggest a man detached from financial reality. No, David interrupted, his gaze unwavering from Richard. The facts suggest a man who understood a reality you can't comprehend. He left you what you value, Richard. He gave you the business, the stocks, the $10 million. He gave you the world you live in. You got his company. He was fair. David paused, letting the weight of his next words gather. And he left me what I value. He left me his art, his legacy, his home. He left me his soul, hidden in the walls, because he trusted that I would look for it. It was a test, Richard, a final test of character. And you failed. Richard stared, speechless for the first time. The psychologist, Dr. Mills, watched the exchange with a keen, analytical interest, his assessment shifting from the dead father to the two living sons. But David wasn't finished. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a copy he had made of the final, crucial passage from his father's journal. I went back to the house, Richard. I read his journals. I wanted to understand why, and I found this. His words. About you. About me. He held Richard's stunned gaze and began to read. I have learned in my long life, David's voice was clear and steady, a judge reading a final verdict, that some people are so poor, all they have is money. I will ensure my wealth, the real wealth, the wealth of the soul goes to the son who understands this. He folded the paper slowly and deliberately. He looked at his brother, whose face had gone from red with rage to pale with shock. The confident bluster was gone, replaced by a raw, stunned vulnerability. The words had struck him like a physical blow, bypassing his lawyers and his arrogance, and hitting him squarely in the heart of his identity. I think Dad was talking about you, Richard, David said softly. Silence. The crisp autumn air was still. The two suited professionals looked at their feet, suddenly deeply uncomfortable, witnesses to a moment of profound and painful family reckoning. Clarice's jaw was slack, her mask of condescension shattered. Richard stood there, utterly defeated. He had come armed with legal threats and psychological assessments, prepared to fight over numbers on a balance sheet. He had been met with a truth he couldn't refute, a judgment from his own father that laid his entire life bare and found it wanting. He had no counter-argument. There was no legal motion to file against a moral truth. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He looked at David, truly looked at him, perhaps for the first time in 30 years. He didn't see his bumbling, unsuccessful younger brother. He saw a stranger, a man who stood with quiet dignity on the porch of a crumbling house, a man who possessed a form of wealth he couldn't possibly comprehend. He saw the son his father had trusted. Without another word, Richard turned. He walked back to his gleaming Mercedes, his movements stiff and robotic. Clarice, after a moment of stunned hesitation, scurried after him. The lawyer and the psychologist, sensing their complete and utter defeat, exchanged a brief, awkward glance and retreated to their own car. David and Lily stood on the porch and watched as the two cars started their engines, turned around in the overgrown drive, and sped away down the lane, leaving behind nothing but the scent of exhaust and a profound, echoing silence. The vultures had been repelled, not by threats or legal maneuvers, but by the simple, devastating power of the truth. They had come to claim a treasure and had left having their own poverty exposed to the world. The confrontation on the porch was a turning point. It was not a victory shouted from the rooftops, but a quiet, seismic shift. The following day, Mr. Harrison called. The legal motions from Richard's lawyers had been withdrawn. There was no explanation, no apology, just a sterile, one-sentence letter of retreat. The war was over. The silence that followed was immense. The media storm, sensing the core conflict had resolved, slowly moved on to its next fleeting obsession. The calls from opportunistic strangers dwindled. For the first time in weeks, David could hear himself think. He was left alone with a crumbling mansion, a vault full of genius, and a responsibility that felt heavier than any amount of money. He stood at a crossroads. He could sell the entire collection, become incomprehensibly wealthy overnight, and leave his old life behind. He could lock the vault and walk away, leaving the secret buried. but neither path felt right. His father's legacy wasn't a lottery ticket, nor was it a burden to be hidden. It was a tool, and David, a lifelong builder, knew that the purpose of a good tool is to create something worthwhile. His first decision was a practical one. With guidance from Dr. Alistair Finch, the art appraiser, and a team of conservation experts, Mr. Harrison helped him assemble. He made a careful, considered choice. He would not fracture the collection. It was a singular body of work and deserved to be treated as such. However, he agreed to the private, brokered sale of two, and only two, of the blueprints to a consortium of world-class museums. The chosen pieces were not the most personal ones. One was the design for the Starlight Bridge, a magnificent public work. The other was an early, unrealized design for a grand library, a project his father had sketched with youthful optimism. The sale was handled with quiet professionalism, away from the glare of public auction houses. The final sum was staggering, more money than David could have earned in 100 lifetimes of carpentry. But as the number was confirmed in his new bank account, he felt not a thrill of excitement, but the solemn weight of purpose. The money wasn't the goal. It was the raw material. His first project was the house itself. Blackwood Manor had been the vessel for the secret, the silent guardian of his father's soul. It deserved to be honored. He didn't want to restore it to a sterile, museum-like perfection. He wanted to bring it back to life, to make it the home it was always meant to be. He didn't hire a faceless construction firm. Instead, he assembled his own team. He sought out the best local artisans, a stonemason whose family had been working the local quarry for generations, a master plasterer who knew the old ways of decorative ceiling work, a landscape artist who specialized in heritage gardens. And he worked alongside them. He was there every day, his truck the first to arrive and the last to leave. He traded his carpenter's pencil for a foreman's clipboard, but his hands were rarely clean. He personally oversaw the restoration of the intricate woodwork, his own calloused fingers carefully sanding and refinishing the oak paneling in the library. He helped the roofer lay the heavy slate tiles, his body remembering the familiar ache of honest labor. He wasn't just fixing a house, he was communing with it. With every repaired window frame and repointed stone, he felt a deeper connection to the father who had designed it. He found small, hidden details, a cleverly concealed join, an unusually complex support beam in the attic that were like private notes left just for him, a conversation in the language of wood and engineering across the years. Lily was his constant companion. After school and on weekends, she was there, not as a laborer, but as a chronicler. She took photographs, documenting the transformation. She spent hours in the vault, which David now referred to simply as the study, carefully cataloging each blueprint under the guidance of Dr. Finch. The project was seeping into her too, shaping her future in ways she was just beginning to understand. As the physical structure of the manor was reborn, David turned his attention to his second, more significant project, building a legacy that looked forward, not just back. He sat down with Mr. Harrison and a team of financial advisors, not to discuss investments, but to talk about divestment. He used the bulk of the money from the sale to establish a new, independent nonprofit organization, the Upr Vance Foundation for Aspiring Architects. Its mission was simple and born directly from his father's painful history of being cheated and overlooked. The foundation would provide substantial, multi-year scholarships and grants to talented, visionary young designers who lacked the financial resources or industry connections to make their mark. It would fund their education, provide them with state-of-the-art equipment, and most importantly, offer them mentorship and legal protection for their intellectual property. It was a shield, forged from his father's pain, to protect a new generation of creators. He took no salary for himself as the foundation's chairman. His payment was seeing the first round of applications come in. He and Lily read through them together, poring over the designs of brilliant young minds from all over the country. They saw that same fiery, idealistic spark that David had seen in his father's earliest journals. The final part of his plan was the most personal. He would not sell the rest of the collection. It was not a commodity. It was a history. He converted the entire west wing of the now gleaming Blackwood Manor into a private museum. It was not open to the general public, but to students, academics, and most importantly, the Vance Foundation scholars. He worked with a museum designer to create a space that was both beautiful and educational. A selection of the original vellums was displayed in archival quality, climate-controlled cases, rotated periodically to prevent light damage. Interactive displays allowed visitors to explore the technical details of the designs, and a small theater showed a short documentary about the quiet, brilliant life of Arthur Vance. The centerpiece of the museum was the vault itself. Its heavy steel door left permanently open, allowing visitors to step inside and feel the awe that David and Lily had felt on that first morning. One crisp autumn afternoon, almost a year to the day since the reading of the will, David stood in the finished museum wing. The floors shone, the walls were painted a soft gallery white, and the soft lighting illuminated the breathtaking genius of his father's work. Through the large windows, he could see the first group of Vance Foundation scholars, 3 bright, eager young people walking through the newly planted gardens with Lily, who was pointing out the architectural details of the house with an enthusiasm that made David's heart swell. A quiet contentment settled over him, a feeling more profound and satisfying than any amount of wealth. He hadn't just inherited a fortune, he had been given a purpose. He had taken the pain of his father's past and forged it into a promise for the future. He had transformed a house of ghosts and memories into a home for dreams. Richard had wanted to build wealth. David had discovered the quiet, immense satisfaction of building a legacy. It was a structure more sound, more beautiful, and more enduring than any skyscraper his father had ever designed. A year can change everything. A year ago, David Vance had been a man defined by the quiet grief of his past and the modest expectations of his future. Now, sitting on the newly built porch swing of a reborn Blackwood Manor, he was a man at peace with both. The late afternoon sun cast a warm, golden glow over the valley. The scent of fresh-cut grass from the manicured lawns mingled with the faint, sweet perfume of the roses blooming in the restored gardens. The house behind him no longer groaned under the weight of time. It hummed with a gentle, vibrant life. The windows gleamed, the gray stone was clean and proud, and the dark timber trim looked rich and strong. It was no longer a house of ghosts. It was a home filled with purpose. Beside him, Lily gently pushed the swing with her foot, a thick textbook on architectural theory resting in her lap. She had a new confidence about her, a sense of direction that had been forged in the dust and discovery of the past year. "The first scholarship recipients are amazing, Dad," she said, looking up from her book. "Did you see the designs Maria was sketching for the Urban Renewal Project? She has a way of thinking about public space it's like Grandpa's journals. It's about how people will feel in a place." David smiled. He would have liked her. He would have liked all of them. The Arthur Vance Foundation was no longer just an idea. It was a thriving reality. The 3 inaugural scholars treated the manor like a second home, spending hours in the museum wing, their youthful energy a perfect counterpoint to the quiet gravitas of Arthur's work. David would often find them in deep conversation with Lily, their heads bent over a blueprint, a shared passion arcing between them. The house was once again a place of learning and inspiration. A comfortable silence settled between father and daughter as they watched the sun dip lower, painting the clouds in shades of orange and pink. It was in these quiet moments that David felt the true nature of his inheritance. It wasn't the number in his bank account, which he rarely thought about. It was this peace, this view, the quiet satisfaction of seeing a new generation of dreamers being given the chance his father never had. The mail had been delivered earlier, and a small stack sat on the wicker table next to the swing. David hadn't looked through it yet. He idly picked it up, sorting through the usual assortment of catalogs and foundation business. And then he saw it. A postcard. It was a simple, generic image of the Swiss Alps. The handwriting on the back was sharp, angular, and instantly recognizable. It was from Richard. David hadn't spoken to his brother since the confrontation on the porch. He knew, through Mr. Harrison, that Richard had taken an extended, indefinite sabbatical from his company, leaving his board of directors in a state of shock. He was traveling, apparently, searching for something. David turned the postcard over. He expected it to be blank, or perhaps to hold a final, bitter sentiment. But there were just 4 short words, written in stark black ink. "The house looks good." That was all. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a request for forgiveness. It was simply an acknowledgement, a single crack in the thick wall of his brother's pride, a concession. It was the first message Richard had sent him in 30 years that wasn't a demand or a criticism. It was, in its own stunted way, a form of peace treaty. David stared at the postcard for a long moment before handing it to Lily. She read it, her eyebrows rising in surprise. "Wow," she said softly. "Do you think he's changing?" "I don't know," David said honestly. "But maybe he's starting to see that some things can be built without a budget." He tucked the postcard into his shirt pocket. It felt surprisingly light. Lily closed her textbook and leaned her head on his shoulder. "I sent in my application last week," she said quietly. "To the architecture program?" "Yeah. In my essay, I wrote about this place, not about the money or the famous blueprints. I wrote about what it felt like to stand in a ruined room and be able to see not just what it was, but what it could be. I wrote about Grandpa and about you." A lump formed in David's throat. He put his arm around his daughter, holding her close. The boy who had given up his architectural dreams because he felt overshadowed by his father's genius was now raising a daughter who was fearlessly stepping onto that same path, inspired by them both. The circle was complete. The legacy was alive. He looked out at the rolling hills, the same view his father had watched for so many years. He finally understood that his father's greatest design hadn't been a tower of glass or a bridge of steel. It had been a plan for redemption, a plan to ensure his life's work ended up in the hands of someone who would understand its true value. The house, the key, the note, the vault, it had all been a map, leading David not to a fortune, but back to his father's heart, and ultimately, back to himself. The $200 million discovery hadn't been the treasure, it had been the catalyst. The real treasure was the quiet wisdom that came with understanding that a home is built not of wood and stone, but of love and legacy. It was the profound, quiet joy of knowing your own worth, a worth that could never be appraised, bought, or sold. As darkness began to settle, the lights of Blackwood Manor flickered on, one by one, casting warm, welcoming pools of light onto the lawn. The house stood on its hill, no longer a monument to decay and secrets, but a beacon of hope and second chances. A home. In every sense of the word, David didn't just restore a house. He restored a family's honor. He learned that the strongest foundations are built on principle, not concrete, and that our true legacy is measured not in the wealth we accumulate, but in the inspiration we leave behind for others to build upon. Thank you for joining us for this Upr Story. We believe everyone has a hidden vault of potential, just waiting for the right key to unlock it. What did Arthur Vance's final lesson mean to you? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story lifted you up, please give it a like, and subscribe to Upr Story for more tales of hidden worth and the triumph of the human spirit. Until next time, keep looking for the value that money can't buy.